What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Thank you for joining me in episode 11 of season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. I ask all of my guests 2 questions. 1, what for them is the essence of a real democracy? And 2, if they could change one thing about our current system of democracy, what would it be? In episode 1.9, we heard from a number of the guests I'd interviewed in season 1 about deliberative mini-publics on their view of the essence of a real democracy. And in episode 2.5, we heard a range of ideas for one change to democracy. Today is another episode where guests share their idea for that one change, sometimes 2, to our system of democracy. I've found the answers people have given to this question fascinating. As I mentioned last time, sometimes people want changes that directly relate to their area of interest. Sometimes they identify an important change in a completely different part of our democratic system. First up, we hear from Peter MacLeod from MASS LBP in Toronto, Canada. I interviewed Peter in episode 1.6 about MASS LBP's work designing and delivering citizens' reference panels.
Happily, it's no one single thing, and so we have to talk about this as in the plural about democracies, and I think proponents in this space get themselves into unnecessary wrestling matches about direct approaches to democracy and representative approaches and deliberative approaches, and then, trying to splice those deliberative approaches ever more finely, creating these elaborate taxonomies. That's good, but I think we're actually at in a space where if it's done well, more is just more. More is better for us right now, and we should be trying to create as many of these opportunities as possible done well.
Well, right now we have a federal government, of course, that has committed to changing our electoral system. They've said that the 2015 federal election would be the last one under first past the post. And I would agree that, any form of that offered greater proportionality would be of benefit. Now, I've just finished saying the problem is we put too much emphasis on elections, but there we go. So I'd like greater proportionality in our electoral system, but I'd also like to see government take more seriously how it can use and work with citizen insights in the space between elections in a substantive way that involves, that devolves, that really makes room at the table for more people to play a serious role.
Next is Titus Alexander from Democracy Matters in the UK. Titus was part of episode 1.10, where he talked about the facilitation process for the 2 UK citizens' assemblies.
Well, I have to say that it will be the topic of my latest book, which is that I think that education would devote a lot more effort and time to enabling people to learn practical politics. In other words, how the system works, what the issues are, how to engage in decisions, and how to have an effective say. Because I think that would increase the quality and level of participation in problem solving. And I think through that process, people will change the democratic system. I mean, our systems are not working very well. They need to be at all levels, from the neighborhood decision making all the way through to global governance. And there is no magic solution to them. But I think if more people are more engaged in a more informed and effective way, it'll make a difference. So from that point of view, if education builds people's capacity and confidence and knowledge to have a say and to decide what they see as being needed in their area, their local area or their area of concern, then I think that cumulatively, that collective action could quite rapidly improve the way in which public decision-making takes place.
In episode 1.3, I spoke with the Premier of South Australia, Weatherill, about why he supports deliberative mini-publics.
Well, that's a really interesting question. How would I change our system? I think I would. It's the generosity of spirit of actually coming together to actually the cynicism that passes for much of the daily discourse in terms of our media-saturated society, I think that's really the enemy of what we're trying to achieve here. So toning down on the cynicism, I mean, the amount of anger and hatred that's directed at politicians, I think is just a self-destructive thing. I mean, politicians are no more than the people that we've chosen to represent ourselves. I mean, they're just ordinary people just like the rest of us, and toning down the cynicism and try and find a way in which we can come together to improve our democracy. It sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish, but I hope that that's something that can be achieved. I'm sure it's necessary if we're going to make the changes that are necessary.
Professor Brigitte Gehrl from Goethe University in Frankfurt was part of episode 1.18, discussing how she approaches evaluating deliberative mini-publics.
Okay, I would like to change a lot of things, make politicians more responsive, make citizens more engaged, and so on and so on. But I think the most important thing I would change is to find better combinations of representative and participatory procedures. Up to now, we have the representative democracy, and then in between, every now and then, we have randomly scattered participatory devices every now and then. And I think what we need is a better combination, a more intelligent combination of representative and participatory procedures, which combine them in a more systematic way. What, for example, Jane Manfred just talked about and others, the idea of have systems combining participatory and representative devices. So I know this is very abstract up to now, and I'm still working on how to make these ideas more concrete and make them more doable and more accessible and more, really applicable in a more practical way.
Next up is Professor Leonardo Molino from LUISS in Rome, who was part of episode 2.3, talking about how to evaluate representative democracy.
I have a quite empirical approach. I've been living for years, maybe also for my culture, in a society with a lot of too much ideology, too much utopia, that were going too much distant from the reality. So there are a lot of things to change. Probably, but if I have to reply to your question, probably I become very much Italian, and I say the possibility of say taking over again by the people, by the citizens of the area where there is a large dominance, a large presence of the organized criminality. And from this point of view, a much stronger action of the people with possibly the collaboration, the cooperation, much stronger action of the police with the collaboration of the people. But this is another utopia, so let's forget it.
And also in episode 2.3, talking about how to evaluate representative democracy, was Professor Wolfgang Merkel from WZB in Berlin.
Okay, I would say equality is something we have to restore. We have to recognize that the class question is back. We forgot too much during our struggle for women's rights, for gay rights, for religious rights, which is perfectly correct. And this is what we had to do to modernize culturally our society. But we forgot very often about the lower third of our society. We became cosmopolitans. This is also correct. And we forgot about the communitarian needs of the lower classes. Here I'm no longer a Marxist as I used to be when I was in my 20s. I'm quite distant from it, but I still think here are some ideas of Karl Marx should come back into our democratic reasoning. It is not everything about cosmopolitan rights. It's not everything about mini publics. It's not everything about deliberation. These are hard questions we have to face, and one of these questions which has to be solved and answered is a question of social economic inequality, and this should be addressed more courageously by our democratic governments and by the citizens as well.
Next up is Zelalem Selassie from Ethiopia, who is a PhD student in Portugal. Zelalem was part of episode 2.4 about non-Western democracy.
There are a lot that I would like to say. I think the good thing that the West should really have is maybe its ideology that democracy is only the Western. That kind of ideology needs to be changed, because if that perception is really changed, and then we can have a different kind of democracy that also make it flourish and or develop, not only to help the Western or to answer the Western limitations, but also of the rest of the world, like in the context of Africa. Now, talking about institutions, what I would like to say in terms of institutions would really be very important. We have in the West, democracy is becoming very passive, in a sense that people are not really, there is no intense democracy, and the public are really getting low in voting, and so the number of the public in order to, or the turnout in order to really participate in voting or actively participating in election or discussing on the matter that really very important in their life are getting low. This is a kind of fading away from the very euphoric or very much interested in political system to that of becoming not caring, if you can say, not really being that much interested. Why that is happening? Because they elect leaders and they end up with working different things, and therefore people would say that even if you elect him or her into the office, what you have in return is different. So that is a crisis. You expect for good, and you end up with the thing that you need not really have. So that's happening in the West and also happening in the rest of the world. You aim for one thing and you achieve. That is a crisis, what I see. Now, how can really that be addressed? My point is that if you are talking about the system, the current system of the Western democracy, I think democracy needs to be pre-planned. We pre-plan in economic sector, for instance. Suppose that the state has a plan to establish a road, or maybe a kind of airport, or maybe a supermarket, or maybe gardening in ecological terms, and we plan and we execute. And one thing that's missing, what I feel, is that in democracy, we do not plan. It is spontaneous, it happens. Why is it so? We, or people really think that democracy is a kind of sudden stuff that will happen once 4 years or once 5 years. And that kind of setting needs to be changed. That's what I see. As a system, we need to really be pre-planning and pre-setting agendas. And imagine that if a certain country knows that they will have a leader 10 years or 20 years from now, why not? It's possible. And make ready that party or that leader within 10 years that he will assume responsibility. And that's what's missing and what needs to be changed. Imagine that you have a leader at the age of very 20s or 30s that you will give an office or responsibility, and you will check him or her knowing that she will or she is potentially a leader in the future. That's very, very important. I think when you see the Chinese, if not exactly the same, they do have this tendency. Even if it is technocratic and you have it that they're benefiting from it. How? Basically, who will be the next leader is known that he will assume. And this is what's missing in the West also. Meaning that, like in the Gada system, they know from the early on that who will from among the chosen or selected, and they will make ready for that. Meaning that before assuming a certain higher responsibility, he or she should really experience it at the very low level and should be tested practically and pragmatically, not for the good speech or not really good campaign that he made, but a good skill that he accumulated over years. And that's really what's missing, and that the West should really also learn from. Imagine from 10 years or 5 years from now that you are making ready a party or a system that would really take over. So I think if we see it in a very broader context, party or kind of leaders would avoid a kind of a winner and a loser kind of perspective. But we are all winners, or considering that all parties or all leaders are contributing for the good being of the public, not only to the ideology of the party. That's the very fundamental problems. And everybody competes for his party's ideology to take over the ideology of the other party. That's nonsense for me. I see it, every person should have a turn in a way that's really pleasing the general public. And that requires really pre-setting and pre-planning and executing. And that is what would really the West can benefit from.
Professor Mark Warren from the University of British Columbia explained his problem-based approach to democratic theory in episode 2.7.
Okay, so I don't know that I have a great answer to this question. I think generally speaking, the developed consolidated democracies are fairly complex and fairly path dependent. They work well enough so that, we won't have revolutions in places like Australia or Canada. But we do need to do some pretty basic things. So these systems need to be, more attentive to the interests of citizens, more engaging, more deliberative, higher capacity in their collective capacities. We would like this to feed through into more political legitimacy. But I think that the way that you get these things, it's complex and it will depend on the kind of system. So, U.S. democracy has one set of problems. Canadian democracy has another set. There are commonalities, but, a separated power system generates different types of problems and pathologies than a Westminster system. So I think that we need to pay attention to the particular type of democratic system and then figure out where to supplement and shore up and layer on new kinds of democratic institutions to increase, engagement, deliberativeness, inclusiveness, legitimacy, capacity, and so on. So no silver bullets, I'm afraid. Incremental hard work to do. So.
Professor Archon Form from Harvard University spoke about pragmatic democracy in episode 2.8.
Can I offer two things? Yeah. So the first thing is, and I have a particular U.S. lens on this, and I know it plays out differently in different places. But for me, the most important characteristic now is inequality and inequality of resources. And that's important, a very distorting force in democracy, because as hard as one might try to keep the influence of money out of politics, or to try to ensure that the only influence in politics is one person, one vote, it's impossible to do. And in a situation in which there's so much social inequality, it's inevitable that those who have more will exercise more political influence. And that is antithetical to the core of democracy. So that's the first thing. The second thing that, if I could wave a wand and change, is that I would wish for citizens to have many more effective organizations that they participate in which they could learn about politics and which they could influence politics. And so I think that is the second huge lacuna in democratic governance right now. In the 20th century, there were many, many popular movements and organizations, including labor movements that in Europe were connected to labor parties. Here, they were also politically very influential, civil rights movements, popular movements. And through these kinds of citizen associations, citizens learn about politics and they get integrated into the political system. And it's through such organizations that form another important bridge, perhaps more important than political parties, between citizens on one hand and governance on the other. And I think it's very difficult to see a really successful democracy that doesn't have a rich array of citizen associations of this kind.
And finally, Associate Professor Sofia Nastrom from Uppsala University in Sweden was my guest on episode 2.9, talking about representation and her upcoming book, The Spirit of Democracy.
I would change the link between democracy and the neoliberal forms of governing that comes through policies like on housing, welfare, on citizenship, education. I think it gives democracy a bad name, and that is undermining democracy from within. It makes human beings compete against each other for social security, status, and positions, and it creates a kind of civil war between groups like migrants, young educated people, and workers who sort of are put up against each other or have to compete against each other instead of making them go together and disclose the kind of power that dominates them. So the thing that I would like to change is the link between neoliberalism and democracy, because it creates a counter revolution, not against neoliberalism, but worse, against democracy in the form of nationalism and sort of protection of your own country and laws. And I think that's a dangerous constellation right now in many democracies.
Thank you for joining me today. In the next 2 episodes of Real Democracy Now! A podcast, I'll be talking to a number of people about what isn't working so well in representative democracy, often referred to as the democratic deficit. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.